These are Meze's new $2,000 or €2,000 Poet headphones. These are high-end headphones from a company in Romania, that's Meze Audio, and they use technology from a company called Rinaro in Ukraine. So at $2,000, they are, well, fairly high-end headphones. And if you've been around the hobby a while, you're probably looking at the Liric sitting beside me and going, are these an open-back Liric? Yes, essentially, Poet, Liric. Okay, we get the idea. There are some changes, and you can see there's a headband change, but also there is a newer version of the driver in here, and a little bit of another surprise in here. If I take one of the, as usual, magnetically attached ear pads off, you'll see it doesn't say QWRM like it does in the Liric. It says AMTS. Yes, they have a licensed version of Dan Clark Audio's AMTS system because he has patented putting a Helmholtz resonator in front of drivers of headphones. You can see there is a silver-black color scheme and a cool church window-like grille on the back, similar to what you see on other Meze headphones. I think the silver-black color scheme doesn't look quite as classy as the Lyrics. The Lyrics, and I can't really show it close up here, I'll have to stick in some B-roll, have this kind of slight patterning to the metal, which looks really classy. And I think that the attachment to the headband looks a little bit classier than on the new Poet, which in silver kind of looks a little bit less inspiring than some of their other designs, like on the other side where you have this really cool shaped piece of metal here. I think, I've got so used to all this cool stuff you have on Meze's headphones that make them look really classy, that even just this part not being quite as classy was a little bit of a disappointment, and the color scheme. I reckon sooner or later they're going to have to make an all-black version. But you do get the kind of reverse curve headband you do get like on the Empyreans, and it does end up being very comfortable to have on your ears. Also, I think that the Lyrics kind of don't fit quite as comfortably with that weird angle design as they do with this titanium alloy headband design, which can adjust very easily and sit perfectly on your ears. So along with everything, it is an improvement, but I just dislike the color scheme personally, but that's just me. I don't know, comment, let me know what you think of the color scheme or whether you're going to bug Meze to make them in black like I did. So that aside, they come with the usual copper cable by default, and with the same connectors, 3.5mm, so you can substitute in anything you like if you so desire, and the usual slidey adjusty headband, which is not as nice as, say, the, they should put an elastic headband like they do on like the 99 Classic and the 109 Pros, etc., and the 105s. Yes, I'll review that later. These I have to do in time for CanJam, which is, they've kind of jumped the queue. But anyway, let's get into the sound, and for that I have taken some notes, which I am going to read as usual to you what my impressions of various music are, while I overlay some nice B-roll pan shots of the headphones close up. But some notes about my listening first. I want to point you towards a video made by Resolve at headphones.com where he measured the frequency response from different people listening to a single pair of headphones and showed the variation between them. So in that, when I do make my impressions, do note that people do have some variation in how they hear, especially the upper mids and treble, and that my impressions may not be quite the same as yours. Now, I did use the headphones out of the Chord TT2 and M scaler system as it's the most neutral I have here, but I also tried it out of other stuff. We have Hi-Fi Man Serenade, and behind me I do have tube amps and the like, and even various dongle DACs as usual, and I'll talk about that as I go along. Now, most of the impressions, though, were done out of the TT2. Now, I listen at a level that when I've done level match checks using my phone and a sound measurement device with a minus 18 dB, 1 kilohertz tone, it comes out at about 75 to 78 decibels or so. And that means I don't listen super loud, it's always at a moderate level, so do take that into account as well. If you listen super loud, you're probably going to have more of a congested sound than I will, especially as these have a bit more mid-bass than do their closed-back counterparts, the Lyric. And also, if you listen at quieter volumes, you may find them a lot easier to drive, even though they are very easy to drive, and you may hear maybe less bass than I do. But anyway, Glen Hansard, Low Rising track from the Strict Joy album. The Poets are on the warm side overall, and because you have an open back behind a planar magnetic driver, rather than the closed back, you get more mid-bass. So they end up sounding warmer than the Lyric and warmer than, say, the E3s behind me. but they end up being very similar to the open-backed Empyreans, albeit because they have smaller cups, ended up sounding more closed in and intimate. The interesting thing was the amount of clarity that came through, that even though they're on the warmer side, I could hear a lot of clarity in the mid-range and treble. So for example, there's enough treble that the clarity comes through, but they don't end up sounding too warm and too dark, at least for me, as long as I don't compare to, say, brighter headphones like the Utopias I often listen with lately. But it doesn't end up fatiguing at all, which is a great thing because that means they can work with a wider variety of music. So for example, the soundstage, again with Glen Hansard, is a bit closed in, and guitars have good bite, and vocals come through very precisely. Now, dynamics are pretty decent at middle volumes, and not having any restriction on the mid bass, you can get more slam, and it's only kind of hampered slightly by congestion, being that they're smaller drivers and smaller cups. So that sometimes makes the brass instruments sound slightly muffled versus, say, the Empyreans, for example. Now, in comparison, the Lyric sounds a little bit more open due to being, of course, closed back and damping the mid bass, which lessens the feel of congestion and making Glen's voice seem more distinct. However, the impact of the music is lessened. So there was a trade-off between kind of warm, intimate, and kind of more open, clear, and that's kind of where it ended up being balanced for most of the music I listened to. Now, with something different, Robert Plant and Alison Krauss, The Price of Love from Raise the Roof, which is also a deluxe edition. It's really funny hearing Robert Plant singing, he was a member of Led Zeppelin, singing, romantic ballads. But this is a rather dreamy track, and it works better out of the Empyrean, for example, than the Poet, because the more spacious, effortless sound of that kind of track works better with, open-backed headphones, which are for larger drivers, larger cups, than the more intimate sounding Poets, for example. And I didn't think the Poet was such a good match with that track. Now, if I go in a similar kind of direction, I go towards classical, for example. Classical is the kind of, music I prefer, big, open, wide, detailed sounding headphones, and kind of more closed in, intimate sounding headphones, I didn't think was really a great match. But the interesting thing was that I noticed better clarity through the Poet's drivers with the AMTS system, whereas not quite as much with the Empyrean. And this is where it got a little bit interesting, because I switched then to, say, Madame Peyroux, who, I hope I pronounced that correct, Between the Bars from her Careless Love album. And this is, you can really hear the subtleties of her singing through this. She's a really lovely singer. And that intimate sound actually worked really well with Madame Peyroux. So even though the sound was more closed in it, I could hear more detail and more subtleties from her singing than I could, say, the Empyreans, which was interesting. And I wonder if the driver upgrade of the AMTS were helping with that. And so in that regard, if not the fact that it makes everything sound more intimate, I felt that the Poet actually did better. Now, an area where I felt that the Poet does really well is with rock. And I've been listening to a lot of Spoon lately, and, a few of their different albums. And that where you have that kind of intimacy, the grittiness of, say, their latest Lucifer on the Sofa album, or one of their latest, I think it is. This is where I really compared with the Dan Clark's E3s. And that kind of punchy rock track is where the Poets do really, really well, where I'm not actually caring about picking out the fine details. I just want the experience more than anything. And it makes the Poet is really punchy and fun with Spoon. It really nails the balance to make this kind of track enjoyable. Whereas the E3, on the other hand, again, sounds a bit more like the Lyric. It's more open sounding. And because it has less punchy bass, it doesn't have that kind of intimacy. And the other thing about the Poets and, of course, the Lyric versus the E3s is, for example, I have the TT2 with the Poets on -17 in the volume in high gain, whereas the E3s were -9, so a lot higher volume to get the E3s going. And that really made a difference if I was using, like dongle DACs, even, fairly high-powered dongle DACs, like this Woo Audio Tube Mini, is that it wouldn't get anywhere near maximum volume with something like the Poet or the Lyric, as I did with the E3, which tends to be more picky how it's amplified due to its lower sensitivity, I think. And so I could get more enjoyment even if I was just listening, say, with the Cayenne RU6, or maybe the not so. It doesn't have like a super great amplifier, but it's still pretty decent. The Hi-Fi Man Serenade, I used it in single-ended output mode, where I think it has less power, and it worked really fine with the Poets. Even being a warm-sounding amp with a fairly warm-sounding pair of headphones actually worked quite well. And there still was a bit of a grade up going to the good old Studio 6 once I got that powered up for driving these headphones, again, which is still a touch on the warm side. The interesting thing was listening with another spoon track was I Summon You from their old Gimme Fiction album, also Deluxe Edition. And it ended up sounding a little bit more grainy from the Empyreans than it did the Poets. Lastly though, Faithless, Evergreen from the Outrospective album. And the E3 is more relaxed sounding, of course, than the Poet. And being a bit more warmer and intimate, the Poet is more fun to listen to that album with, making it feel more emotional, and even if it loses a little bit of clarity in return. So overall, I thought that the Poet it's a fun, punchy headphone. It's good to rock out with. It's good if you want detail, and maybe not bright detail in your face detail, but enough detail to make especially tracks which have some detail and subtlety in them, but you want a bit more of that mid-bass slam that you might get out of, say, the Lyric, which does sound a little bit more open, but not quite the same deal. So it's a different balance, and it's a typical kind of balance you get versus with open back planar headphones versus closed back. But being that they're very easy to drive, it's easier to say, hey, if you buy a pair of Meze headphones, you can power them out of anything and you'll get a good result. Whereas, again, let's say the E3s tend to be, I think, are probably more refined overall, but are more picky about how, whether you'll enjoy them out of different amplification. But I think overall, the better driver, the better comfort, that's definitely a step up from something like the Lyrics. The only thing is, I wish they'd made them in black. Not the silver color scheme doesn't go with me. Let me know what you think. What do you reckon of the two-tone color scheme? I don't think it looks as nice with the orange. I think they wanted to distinguish them from the Lyrics more so than just with the grill and the headband. But I think they didn't need to. I think just those improvements alone were enough. So anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. If you try a pair, let me know what you think. If you buy a pair, also let me know what you think. You can buy a pair through the links in the description. As a note, I will get something back if they are not returned. So I'm not actually here to sell you anything. I'd rather you get a clear picture of what the headphones I review are like, and then either choose to buy them or actually even not to buy them if you think, if you don't want a pair of really warm sounding headphones, well, yeah, obviously these are not going to be suited to you. Do note that. Also, if you're watching this after CanJam, which is when they're going to be announced, do check out my video report about CanJam. And if you're watching this before CanJam, come and see me there if you are going. Also, if you'd like to support my work and get some buying advice, I mean, people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on audio gear, and you want some advice to make sure you're getting the right thing, do send a couple of bucks my way, and you can join my little Discord chat, and I'll happily give you some advice. Or if you just want to send me a message, and I'll give you a reply pretty much within a day or two, and you can ask me about anything about audio that I happen to know about. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.